Okay, this video is an introduction to William Faulkner's novel As I Lay Dying. Just an overview, provide a little context, and introduce you to some of the characters. It's a complicated novel. The telling of it is complicated, and hopefully the information I give you in this video will help ease you into the novel. Here's a quote from one of the characters, Dr. Peabody, who's tending to Addie in her last moments, and I think it's an interesting statement here, and in a way I think it captures the theme of the novel. Peabody says, "I can remember how when I was young I believed death to be a phenomenon of the body. Now I know it to be merely a function of the mind, and that of the minds of the ones who suffer the bereavement. The nihilists say it is the end, the fundamentalists the beginning, when in reality it is no more than a single tenant or family moving out of a tenement or a town." So there is a picture of the first edition of As I Lay Dying, 1930. And there's a picture of William Faulkner. You can still see his house today in Mississippi. It's a Faulkner museum now. So As I Lay Dying was published in 1930, and it's one of Faulkner's earliest novels. His second major novel, the first one being The Sound and the Fury, which had come out a year earlier, in 1929. And both of them were published by Jonathan Cape and Harrison Smith, and they would go bankrupt a few years later. So I guess the Faulkner's novels weren't enough to keep them afloat. The plot of the novel follows a poor rural family's difficult journey from their farm on the banks of the Yoknapatawpha River, which is a fictional river, by the way. It's not a real place. It's set in Mississippi, but the geography of this world is entirely fictional. So they have a farm near the river, and they're traveling to the city of Jefferson to bury a woman named Addie. And she is the wife of Anse Bundren and the mother of 5 children: Cash, Daryl, Jewel, Dewey Dell, who's the only daughter, and the youngest son, whose name is Vardaman. I think he's called Bud a few times in the novel. The title of the novel, As I Lay Dying, interesting. It seems to suggest that the process of dying extends beyond the mere cessation of life. And just I would refer you back to that quote from Dr. Peabody, that dying also involves those who are left behind, who must now find a way to let go and move forward. It suggests that death is not finished until the body is laid to rest and the survivors have come to terms with their loss and resumed their lives. And viewed this way, the body of Addie Bundren, who dies in the first 50 pages of the novel, physically she's dead, but in a way she lives on as her family and neighbors deal with the effects of her loss. So the story itself, a family's journey from point A to point B, from their farm to the city of Jefferson, it seems to be straightforward, but the telling of the story is very complicated, not straightforward at all. Instead of an omniscient narrator, a fairly sort of conventional way of telling a story, linear, sort of a linear progression of plot with an omniscient narrator describing the events from a single detached point of view. Instead of that, we get events described through the eyes of different individuals, sometimes simultaneously. So in other words, we move back and forth between many different points of view, with each chapter being narrated by one of 15 different characters. And sometimes those points of view are describing the same event. For example, the raising of Addie Bundren's coffin in one scene is described from a couple of different characters' perspectives. Cash Cash's and Daryl's. In addition to that, Faulkner employs a technique called stream of consciousness narrative, which means that the characters are telling us what they see, what they say, and what they think in real time using the present tense without the benefit of hindsight or reflection. And they use the language that comes naturally to them. So for the reader, this means not only having to keep straight the competing points of view, but having to deal with multiple voices as well. Cash sounds very different from Daryl. And their thoughts can be disjointed because like I said, they're thinking and speaking in real time. This is particularly challenging with the youngest Bundren, Vardaman, who thinks very much like a child, and his thoughts are very, very elliptical and disconnected. So this approach, the benefit of it is that it gives us access to the interior world of each character. But this approach also raises really important questions about motive and truth. There is no objective point of view that's guiding us along in this story. So every event, every conversation is subject to the constraints of individual perspective. There is no truth that we can see, at least not in any objective sense of the term. There are only the characters' individual perceptions and motivations. You might think of it as each one of them has a truth that is their own, but there is no objective reality that we get to see through the voice of an omniscient narrator. What you see on the left there is a map. This is Faulkner's map. He did several of these in his lifetime of Yoknapatawpha County. And the reason he made these maps is because many of his novels are set in the same place. And in fact, some characters in As I Lay Dying appear in some of his other novels. So he created these maps with you can see in red there the different locations marked out. I'm going to blow it up a little bit. There's Jefferson, Yoknapatawpha County. It's William Faulkner. And over here in the bottom right, you see he has marked the Bundren's farm. And we see going horizontally across the bottom of the map, the Yoknapatawpha River. And he's marked where the bridge was washed away. That's a big moment in the novel, crossing the river with no bridge. They also stay at Armstead's. Some important things happen there, and then they keep making their way north to Jefferson. It's just kind of interesting that Faulkner visualized all this, that he wanted to create a graphic representation of the world of his fiction. So we're going to talk about the major characters now. By major characters, I mean the members of the Bundren family, and there are 7 of them. We'll start with Addie, and this is a quote from her later in the novel. Even though she's dead, she actually speaks in the book, and she says this. She says, "My father said that the reason for living is getting ready to stay dead. I knew at last what he meant, and that he could not have known what he meant himself, because a man cannot know anything about cleaning up the house afterward, and so I have cleaned my house." That is Addie Bundren. Her chapter is very challenging. She's the matriarch of the family. She dies early in the novel, as already said. By the time you get through the first 50 or 60 pages, she's gone. And her final wish is to be buried with her family in Jefferson. And this is a wish that her husband, Anne's, is determined to fulfill despite the obstacles standing in his way. And most of the people they encounter in their journey think that this is ridiculous, that they should just bury her in the churchyard near their home instead of going on this 50, 60-mile trek across a pretty apocalyptic landscape.
to get her to her family burial ground.
She does narrate one chapter. It's about 2/3 of the way through the book, and it's a significant chapter because we get her perspective for the first time on marriage and motherhood, and she reveals some important information about her family, and in particular her son Jewel. So you'll want to make sure you're reading closely when you get to her chapter. It's bad that a fellow must earn the reward of his right doing
by flouting himself and his dead. That would be Ance Bundren speaking there.
He is the toothless elder of the Bundren family. Keeps talking about wanting to get some teeth so that he can eat again. He sees it as his matrimonial duty to bury Addie with her family in Jefferson, like I said. He makes the major decisions, of course, and it's questionable whether he makes the right ones. He's looking at me. He don't say nothing, just looks at me with them queer eyes of his'n that makes folks talk. I always say it ain't never been what he done so much, or said, or anything, so much as how he looks at you. It's like he had got into the inside of you some way, like somehow you was looking at yourself and your doings out in his eyes. That's Vernon Tull speaking,
and he is describing Daryl.
Daryl is probably the most interesting character in the novel. He's the second oldest of the Bundren sons, and he narrates about 1/3 of the novel. He gets 19 of the 59 chapters, twice as many as the character with the next highest total, Vardaman, although Vardaman's chapters tend to be very short. His eloquence and thoughtfulness stand out in comparison to his siblings. He observes many things that others do not observe, like Dewey Dell's situation, for example. And at times he seems gifted with a kind of clairvoyance where he can see what's going on through the eyes of other characters, even though he is not present himself. It is perhaps because of his sensitivity that the hardships of the Bundren family will take the greatest toll on him.
And he says lots of very strange and cryptic things like this.
In a strange room, you must empty yourself for sleep. And before you are emptied for sleep, what are you? And when you are emptied for sleep, you are not. And when you are filled with sleep, you never were. I don't know what I am. I don't know if I am or not.
This is another character speaking here.
It's like some folks has the smooth, pretty boards to build a courthouse with, and others don't have no more than rough lumber fitting to build a chicken coop. But it's better to build a right chicken coop than a shoddy courthouse, and when they both build shoddy or build well, neither because it's one or t'other is going to make a man feel the better nor the worse. This is Cash, the carpenter. He's the eldest of the Bundren sons, very skilled at what he does. He spends the first part of the novel making his mother's coffin, and for the first 3 of his 5 total chapters, he talks about not much else than the coffin. We can certainly discuss why that is. Nevertheless, it was interesting. He gets the last word in the novel and draws some remarkable insights from the family's experiences. Cash also suffers physically more than any other character.
He goes through quite an ordeal.
It really begins before the novel when he falls off the roof of a church, but during the journey to Jefferson, starting at the river crossing, things do not go well for him, and you will wince in pain reading some of those descriptions. He galloped up and stopped. his heels in the horse's ribs, and it dancing and swirling like the shape of its mane and tail and the splotches of its coat had nothing whatever to do with the flesh and bone horse inside them. And he sat there, looking at us. That would be Jewel. So Jewel is the middle child of the Bundren family. In contrast to his siblings, he is physically powerful. That's something you pick up on right away in the novel. And fiercely independent, and sometimes a little menacing, a little threatening. There's only one chapter in his voice, the fewest of any of the Bundren children, and that chapter is very early in the novel. But despite not having a lot to say, his presence dominates throughout. And that's due mainly to the preoccupations of his siblings, who see him as something of an outsider and a mystery. It's like everything in the world for me is inside a tub full of guts, so that you wonder how there can be any room in it for anything else very important. He is a big tub of guts, and I am a little tub of guts. And if there's not any room for anything else important in a big tub of guts, how can it be room in a little tub of guts? But I know it is there because God gave women a sign when something has happened bad. That is Dewey Dell speaking. She's the only daughter of the Bundren family. She attends to her mother during her illness, and she minds Vardaman during the family sojourn to Jefferson. She has more at stake personally than any of her siblings, as the reader learns early on that she is pregnant by a town boy named Leif. He's given her money for an abortion, which leads to several side adventures for her, one of which turns out to be particularly unpleasant for her and unpleasant to read. And we'll talk about that when we get to it. And then finally, we have Vardaman. It was not her. I was there looking. I thought it was her, but it was not. It was not my mother. She went away when the other one laid down on her bed and drew the quilt up. She went away. That's Vardaman. He's the youngest of the Bundrens. He gets 10 chapters, second to only to Darl's 19 chapters, although some of these chapters are very short, and one of them is just 5 words. Because he's the youngest of the Bundrens, there are obvious limits to what he knows and understands about the world around him. That will become very clear to you reading his chapters. He shares his thoughts and feelings in the voice of a child, which can be a challenge for us reading the book. But this also creates opportunities for really arresting and serendipitous insights, as sometimes only a child can deliver. So those are the main characters, the Bundren family. There are other characters that narrate pieces of the story. There are the neighbors, Vernon and Cora Toll. They get 9 chapters between them. Dr. Peabody gets a couple. Reverend Whitfield gets 1. A man named Sampson. Mosley and McGowan, 1 each from them. And Armstead gets 1. And that concludes this introduction to William Faulkner's As I Lay Dying.